to imagine that as artists or people related to these practices, we would take that question on seriously. I think as Nato alluded, it really means that we have to do something other than really be artists, or even imagine there's a space called culture, and really start to imagine that we have to figure out how change happens, how things stay the way they are, and how they can change, and then figure out what are the skill sets, what are the collaborators, what are the systems we need to participate in to do that. And I think, maybe the first thing to say is that going back to Marx, that the idea that you could know the world as a kind of neutral thing is already problematic. Like, to know something is to be involved in change. There's no, that image of being a critic where you stand outside of something and say, well, this is what's going on, is in fact to stand inside of something and be involved in change. And I think that might sound like a semantic difference, but to me it's quite a radical one. The difference for me is between when we imagine that we're in the world, which I think a lot of our practices do, versus being of the world. Like, how are we actually of the world? Not merely in it, but we imagine that the world in all of its complexity has produced us as we produce it. So this idea that David's talking about, if we change the city, we change us. And I think we need, in a sense, to extend that to imagine that what we're engaged with is not just, or when we talk about things like culture, we're talking about ecosystems, large-scale ecosystems, small-scale ones that involve the biological, the geological, the social, and that there's really no gap between what we imagine as human and non-human. There's no way to separate the two. Suburbia, for example, has now become the site of the largest concentration of the deer population in North America. So what does that mean for how we understand nature? When we have to, on some level, realize that the terms we have, like the natural and the cultural, the urban, suburban, they need to change as the world changes. And that when we have, the largest population of ducks in Texas now live also in suburban ponds, and they've left wetlands. What does that mean for how the world looks? And, you could go, okay, this is all really trivial, and, our problems are quite different. But I think it's an important type of shift to imagine that what we could be involved in as cultural practitioners is in the co-composition of the real. Like that's the fundamental thing that we're always doing all the time. And that there's a way of being conscious about it in the sense David's talking about. And not imagine that it's just in one scale, but that we're working at, we need to work at 10 or 15 scales at once. We have to imagine scales of biology, scales of geology, scales of the city, scales of representation, all at the same time. So I wanted to illustrate this with an example from some of the work we've been doing recently at Spurs. And we were invited to work in Athens, Ohio with people on the question of acid mine drainage, which is what happens when you use up a coal mine, you leave essentially a big hole in the ground with a little coal. That fills with water, and that water starts to turn into highly acidic runoff. The runoff fills the streams and creeks. The streams and creeks die, the whole area changes. So you have this pollution problem. But the standard way we think of pollution is, in a sense, like the BP oil spill. It's like it's something somebody's put out there, that we have to scoop up. But the problem of acid mine drainage is in fact that there's a bacteria in the water in the mine that makes the mine its new ecosystem. So you could say that it's a natural product. Coal gets immersed in water, bacteria comes along, you have a new ecosystem. So like the things, how we normally think about it, pollution comes from a cultural world, taken from a natural one. All of those divisions start to break down and not become very useful. And so the question is really in this idea of how we compose the real, is like we have to come up at this point with a system that recomposes the given. You can't merely take it out, put it in something, and all those kind of modernist dreams like pollution could be put somewhere, or all our problems could be put somewhere, are kind of mythic spaces that we still want to have. And so our realization, working on this with a lot of people, microbiologists, ecologists, community groups, was that the easiest way, or one of the easy ways to deal with this, is in fact have another bacteria that eats heavy metals. So just make another ecosystem. And that, and that had been tried before, but the problem was it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to manufacture weapons. So then what we proposed most recently, and we're still working on, is that what if you reintroduce the beaver? So then it became a question of, well, we don't make art for people in this case, but we need to make art for beavers. Because we need to understand what are the attractors that would pull beavers into a system to co-compose with you. A system that would allow you to have attractors for bacteria would then lead to clean streams, which would then lead to things in the human habitat that we find pleasurable and livable. But so, just as a quick and brief example, I think when we take the idea of experimental geography and how we imagine pushing outside of cultural practices, outside of representations, to really take on this question, what does it mean to do more than know the world, but actually to change it? I think that's a radical challenge to how we understand the space of art and culture, and it demands a whole new skill set. And I think, as Nato was saying at the beginning, looking at art history and imagining you have a lens to look at the world, at that point becomes profoundly trivial. And I think the real set of things is to find methods of collaboration that cross human and non-human scales, to find new ideas of agency. Like what politics does the Gulf Stream have? What's the agency of rubber shoes? How do bacteria co-compose this? The questions really have to change from even ideas like, is power, knowledge, map, representation, territory, to really imagining, not answering those is questions, like what is this, but asking what can be done with it. So I think, you can say, well, maps are representations, but what kind of tools are they? Like, how can we invent maps to navigate these kind of complex human and non-human systems? How can we invent geographic techniques that connect enormous scales of time and place, changes to Arctic ice melts, as well as to cougar populations in Chicago? So that's kind of where my curiosity is, how we extend these questions, how we expand, in a sense, neo-Marxist paradigms to move to these highly productivist, what Isabel Stengers calls cosmopolitical, in terms of producing a cosmos, producing new collectives that are human and non-human. And what's the role of art in that?